option. Okay. All right. So today we're going to be going through using forms in HTML. This is a subject that sort of some of you might be familiar with already. A lot of people think they know how to use forms. And then when you really start digging into the behavior behind it, you find there's a lot of stuff you may not know, a lot of stuff that's actually very helpful, makes our life easier as developers. So the focus of this session is to introduce you to HTML forms if you haven't used them before. And if you have, then go through some of the more sophisticated behavior that you can employ. So first of all, I'm just going to copy this link and put it in the chat. So this is all of the code for the session today. I've done my best to break it up into headings and done a little navigation here, so it should be easy enough to navigate, but it is quite a long document. All right, so to introduce forms, like what are they? We know what a form is when we're doing paperwork or we're applying to something. We have to fill out a form and put our name, our contact details, etc. And when we submit that form, say we submit an application form to the bank, if we've done something wrong, if they've said email address and we put a phone number, that's going to be a problem and someone's going to process that form incorrectly. So the form will say quite clearly, put your email address, and this is the format that we expect you to submit the form with. The HTML version of forms is exactly the same. It's for the same purpose. It is a way of passing information from A to B. So in our case, most of the internet is sort of read-only. Like you visit a web page and you're consuming the information. You're not really providing any information back to the server. The only time where you actually can provide input back to the server is within a form, using a form input, for example. And this is true for every web application, for every framework out there, whether it's Angular or React or Vue. They're all using the underpinnings of HTML forms under the hood, even if they sort of abstract that away or they provide you with other methods to do the same thing. So forms are crucial for user interaction. And as a front-end developer, user interaction and user experience is one of the most important things to be bearing in mind. And why they're important? Well, apart from handling all of your users' input, they're actually sort of like a building block of the internet itself. Before we had fancy JavaScript tools such as Regex, you couldn't really send a request without loading a new page. So every time you wanted new information, you had to reload the whole web page. There wasn't any asynchronous requests or anything like that. And what a form does is when you submit, it submits that data to a specific web address. And the code at that web address, the server can take that code, process it, save it in the database, and do something with the result. So in the early days of the internet, forms were the only way to do this. If you had to do any kind of interaction, you had to submit a form, it had to take you to a different page, and then you would see the result of the page there. There wasn't really any validation techniques, so you had to sort of send the form and hope for the best. And if there was an error, you'd only see the error once you'd had the response from the server come back. Things have changed a lot and for the better. So now we have asynchronous requests, which mean that we can send a form without having to reload the page. And we also have nice validation techniques that we'll go into in this session. The point of all this is to say, the internet is actually built around forms, not vice versa. Forms are a real request. When you send a form, you are sending HTTP request. And so if you can learn how to assemble your forms in a really good way, you can actually just send data straight to a server without having to use JavaScript at all. And not a lot of people seem to be aware of that. So the anatomy of a form. In this example, I have the most simple form that I can create. It has 3 elements: form element, an input element, and a button element. There's not really that much decoration on these elements in terms of attributes. So you can see that input has the attribute type and the value text, but that's really it. So this is a very, very basic form. It doesn't actually do anything. So it won't attempt to validate the text you type in here, and it won't prevent submission if there is nothing typed in the input. And also it won't send that data to any location once you've clicked the button. So this form is very simple, very easy to understand, but completely useless. In order to give it some utility, we have to start decorating it. So I'll just zoom in a little here. So we can see we've applied this action, which is the URL address that we want to send the data to. And then we've applied method get. And this is the way that we're actually going to send that data. You don't have to worry about this too much, but it will be obvious in a second what this is doing. So with the input, we've kept this type text. We've given it a name of example because it's example input. And we've also given it a CSS class just so that we can style it a little and make it look nice. But that is really not a functional part of this example. For the button, we've only given it CSS class, and that is for the same reason, just to make it look nice. There is nothing extra that you need on this button. It will automatically submit the form. It knows how to do that. So this form we've just described here, this is what it looks like with my CSS applied. If anyone is curious what it looks like without the theme, we can disable it here. And you can see it's kind of just like a, you can't even really see anything because the text is white. So we're going to put that back. And the background color is green because it is valid, because there is actually no way of this input being invalid at this point. Close DevTools. So what happens if we put some text in here? Hello world. We have the action, we have the method, and if we hit submit, we will be taken to the same page we were on, which is index.html. You can see here that it's encoded our input value, the name, and the value. Let's try that again. Okay, so we have the input name, the input value, and then this success is just where in the document we should go to. So it's this ID here. So that simple form works pretty well, but obviously that's not really enough to do useful things with yet. We do need some sort of validation. So what is validation? As I mentioned with the example for your bank form, validation is just any process that runs over the data the user has provided, and it will assess the data and tell you if it is appropriate or if it's inappropriate. So if you enter a phone number into an email address field, you should see some sort of warning message telling you that this is wrong. And that is what validation is. There are 2 types of validation. It happens in 2 different places in the web stack. So we have client-side validation, which is what we're concerned with. And then you also have server-side validation, which we're much less concerned with. Client-side validation refers to any process that happens on your browser, happens on your computer whilst you're visiting a web page. So any sort of highlighting or background color or an underline or a warning message, anything like that that the user experiences, that is client-side validation. And conversely, anything that happens on the server, anything that happens remotely away from the user, i.e. on the computer that is running the website, not on the user's computer, that is server-side validation. These two types of validation are actually intended for different purposes. So client-side validation is almost all about providing a good user experience. If you're going through your form and there's nothing to tell you that your username should be 16 characters and you keep trying 15 and 14 and 13, it's going to be very frustrating if you're not receiving any feedback on that. So we're mostly concerned with ensuring that a user can work their way through a form, provide all of the detail, all of the information as we expect it to be provided, and that also they're not going to get frustrated in the process of doing that. Server-side validation is much more important. It is a security task. So if you think about your house and your front door, if every time someone knocked on your front door, you just opened the door straight up and let them through, you would have no server-side validation. Instead, every time someone knocks on the door, you ask, who is it? And if it's someone you know, then yes, you're going to let them through. It's the same with data. So if someone submits a form, the server is going to ask, is this data really what I've asked for? And is it going to be safe for me to store it in the database? And if it's not safe, or if it's not what was asked for, it will be rejected. When a request is rejected, it will come back with an error code. The error code will often come with a message which will say exactly what went wrong. So for example, if you submit a form and you get a 400 error in return, you will probably get a message saying, oh, you didn't fill this field out correctly. So client-side validation, first, make sure the user is happy, and second, make sure that that server validation process is most likely going to succeed. The problem is that anything that happens on your computer, on the client, it is under your control. So if we were just relying on client-side validation to do all of this, we would have a problem, because any of you who know how to open Chrome DevTools, you can start messing around with the form and the script, and you can turn off validation entirely and send whatever you want to the server. So by combining client-side validation, which can be switched off, and server validation, which cannot be switched off, that is the full picture. Luckily for us, client-side validation is all we're going to be looking at. Otherwise, the session would be about 20 hours long. And we're also just going to be looking at HTML form validation. So if we scroll down to here, there are two different ways to validate form content, and you can mix them a little bit as well if you like to do that, although I prefer to keep the concerns sort of separated as much as possible. So there's HTML validation and there's JavaScript validation. HTML validation just uses HTML attributes to control the whole thing. You don't have to declare any JavaScript. You don't have to do any sort of configuration in JavaScript. It will just happen automatically in your browser. JavaScript validation should be, or it has to be custom written for your form. It can often be quite long and repetitive because you're sort of setting, checking this value, checking this value, checking this value. So it can end up being a bit of an ugly, large, repetitive JavaScript file. So before considering using JavaScript for validation, I always recommend people look at HTML5 validation, because it is very powerful, and it actually provides some things that you can't do on your own with JavaScript. For example, showing a warning message when an input is incorrect, you have to write that warning message from scratch, and you're also going to be writing it in your chosen language. If a user in China visits your page and experiences an error, they might not know English or Norwegian or Dutch or whatever language it is you've written it. Whereas if you use HTML validation, the browser default language will be used to show that message instead. And it means that a lot of these error messages can be shown directly to the user in their home language, which is a sort of freebie you get from using this. All right. So let's take a look at the first of my example forms with validation. So we have form with ID search dummy, a field set, which is this this white line around here that's the field set. That's just a sort of way of containing form elements. You don't have to use it. I like how it looks. We then have a div, which is just for layout. It just has some margin on it. And then our input element, which is the important part. So again, we have type text. We have name term, because we are going to be entering a search term here. We have the same class for styling, and we have the required attribute. So this required attribute is our first bit of validation, HTML validation. It just says the input has to be more than 0 characters long. And that's the only thing we're asking from this, this form here. So we should be able to type A, and it's valid. We can see from the CSS background color that it is valid, ABC. Okay, cool. If we try and submit it without entering anything in there, we'll be told, please fill in this field. And that message will be slightly different browser to browser and from in different countries. If we do satisfy this, it doesn't actually do anything. It just bounces us back to the same page. Actually wasn't supposed to do that. It doesn't really do anything useful. So if we just compare what we have here to what we have here, we've done the same thing. We've decorated this form tag with an action, a method, and that's the only difference between these two. Otherwise, they're exactly the same. Now, if we do a search, we can go to a real search page and we can hit a real API and we can perform a real search on a real data set, which is pretty cool. So we can, we're not going to cover exactly how this search page works unless we have time, which I suspect we won't. But that's just to show you that even without a server, you can actually make a working search page using HTML forms and no JavaScript. So the next thing that we might want to control with validation is how long a string is. So in this case, we have a subject input, and we want the subject to be between 4 and 20 characters. And we've done that by providing these min length and max length criteria. So if I start typing ABC, it's not valid. If I try and send a message, tell me that I have to add length to my string, currently using 1 too few, and now it's valid. So I think that's pretty self-explanatory, quite useful for passwords and for usernames and that sort of thing. So for email, email is a very, very common task. So it's a very common thing to be asked your email in a form. And it's also a very predictable format because it has sort of has your name at your domain name. So you know that it's going to have, at the very least, a string section of normal characters. It's going to have one @ symbol and some more characters. And for this, there is a special input type called email, which will handle this automatically for you. So I've just got required and I've got type email. That's the only validation attributes I've got on here. And if I type test.123. blah, 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 and submit, it's going to tell me that this is not a valid email address, which is quite correct. Test@something.com is valid. You will notice that I can actually submit this, which is not a real email address. there are limitations to all of these default strategies using HTML, and there are solutions to all of those limitations also. The reason this happens is because the email address specification is not quite what we think it is, and there are some strange email addresses out there that are very uncommon in the wild that have to be catered for by this input type. So that is specifically for email. We've got one for length, and now we've got something a little bit more complicated. So there are going to be times where there isn't a special type of input provided for you already, and there's not a special attribute that's going to do exactly what you need it to. For example, in this example, we are creating a username, and there are rules about the username. So it says that the username must be between 3 and 16 lowercase characters, numbers, hyphens, or underscores only. So we can't put an exclamation mark, we can't put a space, we have to keep it to those characters. This is not something you can do with an off-the-shelf attribute. You have to use something called the pattern attribute. The pattern attribute will use a regex pattern, which is regular expression. Regex is the funky looking thing here. It is a language used to work through text and find patterns that match. So it looks really weird, and no one loves the way regex looks. It always looks ugly, but you do sort of get used to what it's doing. It's performing quite an abstract task, and so it's hard to perform an abstract task without the code itself sort of being a bit hard to understand. In this case, I'm looking for a string that contains the letters A to Z, 0 to 9, underscore, hyphen. And I'm asking for 3 to 16 instances of anything in this these brackets here. So this is what's allowed, and this is how many of the allowed things I want to see. Now, obviously, this here is not very helpful for a user. So if something goes wrong in this form, because of this rule, the user is going to be completely lost if you tell them, oh, your input was supposed to match A to Z, 0 to 9, underscore, hyphen, 3, 16. It's not helpful in the slightest. So we have this title attribute, and this is your chance to provide a nice descriptive explanation of what the problem is if this input does not validate. So we have 3 to 16 character username containing only lowercase letters, numbers, underscore, and hyphen. And we also have a little bit of extra help text here, which is less specific and sort of just meant to help the user in another way. You can see it here. The placeholder in this case has been set to a sort of example of how to use all of the characters and what is accepted, but the text isn't actually here. So that's why it's currently red, because the required attribute hasn't been satisfied yet. So if I type in test 1, 2, 3, 4 underscore hello, that is fine. If I put an exclamation mark, now we're invalid. We can't send this anymore. And you see here, when this is invalid, you have your custom error message here. That will not be translated. So that's always going to be in English or whatever language you write it in. But this part saying, please match the format requested, that will be translated at least. These patterns can be pretty daunting. I do have some resources in this web page that I use myself to make writing regex much easier. It's not something that can be done intuitively very easily unless you have a very large brain. So don't be scared when you see a string of regex and you don't understand what it does. It's normal. There are tools that you can sort of paste the regex in and it will show you what it's doing exactly. Okay, so To apply some of this regex in a real situation, we're introducing the phone input. So this is type tel, and this is designed to capture a phone number. Now, if you thought that the email address thing was a bit weird, that you could do name at domain without a .com, this is even weirder. In a standard telephone input, you can put pretty much anything. It's going to be valid no matter what. Obviously, 2 is not a real phone number, but the input, it can't actually be more specific than this because there are so many different number formats around the world. So in Norway, in the UK, in the US, South Africa, etc., every country has a slightly different format for how they write out their phone numbers. And when the guys who are, people who are writing the HTML validation specification, they sat around and they shared notes and they tried to find a one-size-fits-all solution, and they couldn't. So there is actually no way to validate a phone number exactly using the built-in type tel attribute. In order to do this, we have to combine type telephone and the pattern attribute, and we have to use both. So in this case, 2 is a valid phone number, but in this case, we've added a pattern, a title, and some more help text. And now our input is expecting a Norwegian formatted phone number. So if I type in my South African phone number here, 0027, okay, so it's invalid. If I type in 0047, and an 8-digit number afterwards, that is also valid. I can change this to plus. I can leave it like that, but I can't just have the number on its own. It needs to have the area code, and that's what I've specified in here. I'm looking for 0047, or I'm looking for +7, or I'm looking for 47, followed by 8 digits. And if I don't satisfy this, I have a message saying, please match the format requested, Norwegian phone number format, etc. So this is a way of customizing your phone input to the region that you're serving. If you're serving all regions, it is actually better not to use this sort of validation because it might disable a user from being able to enter their real phone number, which is very frustrating. So if you know that you're only going to be accepting applications from a particular country, you can limit it to their format. Otherwise, it is actually better just to leave this be, or to use a JavaScript library to do a bit more involved validation here. Here are the resources that I mentioned earlier. This is for understanding Regex. Regex 101 is a great tool for showing you visually how your Regex works. And then Regex Hub is a place where you can come and borrow scripts or borrow snippets that do useful things. So if you're unsure of how to target a particular pattern in Regex, do a search for it first, pop it into Regex 101. So if we take a, let's take, okay, source of an image tag, that's a good one. So we'll put it in here, it looks like garbage. Then we're gonna have div. So far there's no matches, image, no match, image source equals example. And there's the match. Okay. This one was too complicated. Yeah. I think that doesn't quite do what it actually describes. HTML tags. So this one should. identifies HTML tags using this code, just as a random example of how this platform works. So both of these are very useful for testing regex. Use them. All right, so we've been through quite a few different strategies so far, and we can actually assemble these together into one. So using all of the things we've looked at just now, we can put it into this long form. And if we go to this page, we can see this form isolated on its own. So we have name, username, email address, phone number, message. And we've already been over exactly how each of these are validated. So I'm going to put in my name. That's invalid. Okay. So everything's satisfied. If we've forgotten one thing, it'll tell us exactly what we've forgotten. If we've forgotten two things, it will tell us what we've forgotten in sequential order. So that is also quite helpful for locating where each issue is one by one, instead of giving the user a sort of shotgun blast of 5 different errors all at one go. And if we submit this form, we go to a thank you page. It has a little bit of JavaScript here that has picked up the form values from the URL here. So you can see like message equals, this is a test message. And that data has been picked up by a script and placed into this table here. So that is actually a lot of what you should know about validation. It is not that complicated apart from the regex part, which is just complicated for a different reason. Most HTML validation is quite common sense. You have required fields or optional fields. You have a minimum length to input. If you have a number input, you can set a maximum number. You can set the steps of the number, so you can increase the number by 100 units instead of 1 by 1. There are lots and lots of these attributes, and before you start writing JavaScript to control your form, just take a look through and see if there actually is a tool available to you already, because a lot of the time you can save yourself a lot of time. So with the last half of this session, we can. Actually, I'll open up some questions now, because we're going to go into some more advanced stuff in a second. So if there's anything that that wasn't clear or fell out, did I fall out or did you fall out? Okay, I'm not sure about that. Can someone repost the link? Yep. All right, so if there are any questions on using attributes for form validation, or if I need to go through one of the examples, again, now is a good time, because we will be moving on to something a little bit more advanced in a second. Okay, I take that silence as everyone understood perfectly. So now we can go into one of the examples and start to play around with this in JavaScript. So there's two sides to the JavaScript coin when it comes to forms. You have the pre-submission JavaScript, i.e. you're still working on your form, and when you hit the submit button, it hasn't actually left your computer and gone to the server yet, it's still on your browser. Then you have post-submission code. So the two examples I've showed you already, the search form here, This uses post-submission JavaScript. So there is JavaScript on this page that runs when you land on the page. There's no JavaScript controlling this. So this is pure HTML. And once you get through to here, all of this stuff is generated by JavaScript. So we will take a look at how you do that sort of thing. And we'll also take a look at setting up a form with JavaScript so that when you hit search, you're not immediately taken to a different page, but instead you receive your results, or you receive your output where you are in situ without having to refresh the page, because that is typically how forms work in the modern web. When you submit a form, you don't expect the page to refresh. You expect a loading icon and then a thumbs up, basically. So if we open up VS Code and make this a bit bigger, perhaps too big, okay. And we go through to one of our, so let's go to the contact form. So in the contact form, all we have is our style sheet, and we have the form code that we've already looked at. All I'm going to do here is add a script tag. We're going to call this JS contact.js. And now create contact.js in here. Okay. So the purpose of this file is to intercept the form submission. So when you click the submit button, that triggers an event. The event is called submit. And every event that happens in the browser can be intercepted with an event listener. So what we're going to do is we're going to set an event listener for this contact form, which is called form ID contact. So we can grab it like this: const form document query selector form hash contact. Okay. Now we can add an event listener to the form. I'm going to ask for submit. And now we can put a function here, which takes a parameter called event, which is the submit event. And console log, just for the sake of demonstration, contact form. Okay, do we contact JS? Oh, right, we haven't tried to submit before. Okay. I'm actually going to remove a couple of these fields, otherwise it's going to get a little bit annoying to do this repeatedly. So I'm just going to hide some fields. We'll hide username. And we'll hide phone number, because that's also going to take a bit of time. And we'll leave the rest. So we're just going to have name, email address, message subject, and message. Now when we hit submit, you saw that flash of a message maybe. And if I go to settings and preserve log, I can show you this again. So before we navigated to this other page, we had this thing submit event, which was logged. And that is what we're going to be working with in JavaScript here. So every event has a target. And in this case, the event target is going to be the form HTML. So these two things are basically the same. We could not write this out because we already have a declaration here, but it is always a good idea to use what's been provided to you in the event rather than referring to a global variable. these two things are literally the same, but it's sort of more hygienic to do it this way, because that means that if your form listener gets placed into the wrong file and this variable doesn't exist, nothing's going to go wrong, or at least you won't be targeting the wrong element. So this is just a good habit to be in, using event.target. So before we do anything else, actually, we need to do event.prevent defaults. This is going to stop the form from changing the URL and reloading the page. And if we do console.log form here, send message, there's no refresh now. And we can see that we've logged out our form element, which is exactly the same as this one. So what can we do with this? Well, a lot of people will do, the next step will be something like this. Name equals document, query selector, input ID name. Or even better, dot value. So this works, but this is ignoring all of the tools and all of the utilities that have been provided to you by the event object. So instead of doing this, we can actually just do something like this: form.name.value, and it's going to be the same for email. And it's going to be the same for subjects. And message. Okay. The reason that we can access these things, let's just do a console log. So the reason we're able to access those in such a nice way is because we've provided the name attribute on the HTML. So here, the name, this lines up directly with this. So if you fail to provide the name attribute on an HTML input element, you're going to lose out on some of this convenience that you get from JavaScript. So we can easily get to all of the form fields. We can also do something like this if we want to double check our validation. Is name valid? Form.name.valid. It's going to be true or false. Could have the opposite, is name invalid. We can also check if the is form invalid. So you can see that already by using these attributes, we've got quite a lot of tools that are very useful to us, considering what the next steps are going to be here. So if I leave all of this, these are all going to be true because the submit event can't actually happen unless the form tags are valid. So what would be the next thing we do in an application once we've collected our, we've stopped the form submission event and we've collected all of the data? We're going to want to send it somewhere, and we're probably going to use fetch to do that. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to write a new asynchronous function, send form, contact form more specifically. And this is going to replace the event listener here. So we want to take these two, and we're actually just going to replace this whole thing. So on the submit event, this function will run. And we are going to use a try catch block because there is always a chance that when you are dealing with an HTTP request that something could go wrong. Excuse me. So whenever you're sending something over the internet, you can't be sure that the network is going to be okay. You can't be sure if the server is going to be online. And you also can't be sure that the input you're providing is going to be valid. So try catch is a way of ensuring that if something goes wrong during flight, that doesn't break your application. So we're going to have response equals await fetch. We're not going to put anything in here yet. And then we're going to have data equals await response.json, which is pretty normal. Anyone who's dealt with fetch should be very familiar with what's going on here. But there's a URL missing here. So what do we put in here? Well, the most sensible URL to put in the fetch field is going to be form.action, because this is the URL here that we've specified is the endpoint for this form. So it would be kind of weird if we intercepted this form submission and we didn't then send it to this URL. And this is available as form.action. In our case, we're going to do a little bit of extra config because we also have method. So we're going to have method equals form.message. And this means that now when we change this to post, which is more appropriate for submitting more appropriate for submitting details sort of over the internet. So for example, as the question asks here, if you were sending data to PHP or Python or a backend, you would set this to post and you would have this be something like thankyou.php. And then your scripts to handle the submission would live in that PHP file. But since we don't have a backend, that's why I'm using HTML, and that's why I'm using get, purely so that the form values are encoded into the URL. If I was to do this and post the form values directly to HTML, we wouldn't really have a way to access those without a backend language. So that is the purpose of using get in this case. So we can set the form.method from the attribute. And normally you would also have something like this. So body, and then you might have like name equals form.name.value and so on. But our form is already shaped in the way that we want it to be shaped. All of the inputs already have appropriate names. They all have the right sort of type because we've selected the input type. So it's a little bit redundant to come in here and say, okay, subject equals subject.value. And I'm a lazy developer. Many developers are lazy, and to me, this looks like a lot of work just to state something that I've already stated in HTML here. So instead of doing all of this, I'm just going to say new form data, and I'm going to use my form to create a form data object, which is a special type of data that is used for servers to amazingly process form data. It is built for the task. It is very, very old, and it works very, very well. So why would we use anything else? Why would we use JSON when we can use form data? So in this case, I can't actually send it anywhere because I don't have a backend running. So this will fail. But this is how your form event listener will look, and this form action should then be set to whatever the appropriate API endpoint is, or if you're using WordPress, a PHP file maybe. So for now, well, we can run that and we can get a console error telling us that we don't have a server running, basically. In the next session, I'll work with Node.js to so yeah, it says failed to execute fetch because we get okay. Right, that's because I'm using get, so change this to post. So we get an error message basically saying that something went wrong because we don't have a backend running, so we don't have anywhere to send this data to, which is a shame, but this is exactly how it should be set up. I will just add these changes here. To Git. Okay. I'm not sure I understand that last question. Can it be stored in a cache or saved to a normal text file? The form itself, yes. So what I will do is I will open up the network tab. And we can look at what happens exactly when you send this, even though it's going to be an error. So when we send, we create a new HTTP request. It comes back with an error message 405 because it wasn't going to work anyway. And it says there's nothing there at the response. But if we look at headers, we can take a look at exactly what we instructed the computer to do. So you can see here that we instructed it to send to a local IP address with the thank you HTML address, location using method post. And if we go down here, we can see form data. I can't see it right now because Zoom UI is in the way. Okay, here we go. So you can see here, form data, name, email, subject, message. This is exactly what we sent to the server. So I'm just going to copy and paste that into a new file. That doesn't help very much. Okay. So this is exactly what we sent to the server. And it looks kind of bad. I'm going to save it as just a plain text. It looks ugly, but it is really just a way of encoding the data in a way that the server understands. And the whole point of using this form data technique here is so that you don't have to write this stuff out yourself like this. Because obviously, if you had to do that every time you're sending a form, that would be very annoying. Instead, this stuff is generated automatically. So that's what it looks like to the server. Could you store it as a plain text file in a new subfolder? You could. I think a backend developer would have some serious concerns about that sort of strategy, because if you have your server running and you are accepting user input, and they can type whatever they want into that input, and then you're going to store that file on your server, they could very easily write bad code. And let's say your web server is like, well, let's type it out. So, oops. So if your domain name is my domain, and you have a contact form like that, and you want to save the response from that contact form as an actual file rather than into the database, let's say you are saving it as my domain submissions ABC. If I can write any kind of programming language. If I can write PHP, or if I can write C# or whatever the server is actually running on into this ABC file, even if it's a text file like this, that's bad news, because after I've submitted my contact form and created this file here, I can put this into my browser and I can run that file. So that would be a very quick way to hack a server if they allowed you to do that. And that's typically why when you send data to a website, it goes into the database rather than being written to the file system. We are very, very careful about what we write to the file system with a server. But the same is true, if you're uploading an image, the same is true. And the way that you deal with that is that you set a policy for the folder where the image is going to be saved in. So you could have a folder called submissions, and you could just have a policy on your server that you never execute any code inside that folder. So yeah, it's possible, but extremely highly not recommended to store submissions as files in your file system. Much better to use a database. And one of the other benefits you get from using a database as well is that over time, there have been a lot of injection attacks where someone will, let's say, you're in your contact form here and you fill everything out correctly, and now I want to cause some trouble in here. Well, I could write something like this. Actually, I don't know how to do a SQL injection off the top of my head. Anyone who knows SQL who's screaming at me, muted, you can unmute yourself and tell me how to do this. I don't write SQL for a reason. So the idea with a SQL injection is that the first characters of your message are meant to terminate a database statement. And then once that's terminated, you can make your own statement. So this is like a really crude example of how you might how you might intentionally cause your target web server to delete information from their database without meaning to. And this sort of thing, this sort of attack, this is very well protected against now. So there are lots of mechanisms in place to stop this from happening. But this is what we're trying to avoid when we are using server-side validation. So we're trying to stop stuff like that either making its way through, or if it does make its way through, to prevent it from having a damaging effect. And with SQL, you have prepared statements. So with a prepared statement, you basically cannot achieve this ever. And that's one of the benefits to using a database, is that there's another security layer there to prevent someone from loading stuff into your site. I will wrap up by looking at the JavaScript I wrote for the couple of examples. So for the search example, that's the most fun. Sorry, I just lost that. Okay, so let's go to the example page here. Okay, so the way that this page works, if we go to the code, search.js. So there's quite a lot of functions here, but none of them are too big. The onSearch is the big boy that does most of it. And if you look here, most of this is console log statements anyway. So I can actually remove all of these console log statements to neaten things up. But if we get rid of options here, nope, that's the wrong button. How do I click that here? Clear the console. So you can see that I'm just logging stuff to the console here for my own purposes. But if I get rid of this, we'll have a bit more clear view on what's happening with the code. Okay, so it's not actually that long. It looked much worse than it was. So what we're doing here, this code is running on the search.html page and showing our results. So the first thing it does is it needs to look at the URL and find a term, which in this case is TES, because I know that that is a search term that yields results. So the first step is to identify this term. In our case, TES. We're then running a function to set the meta description or the meta title for the page. And we're also just changing this, this text here to whatever has been searched for. So if I do that, I can rewrite this in the URL bar. So this one is just doing a little bit of window dressing. And then we have state.items equals get items with the term. And this is an async API method that hits JSON placeholder and gets 100 random posts back and does nothing else. So all it does is it goes to the server and it responds with an array of the items. And if I get my logging back, we can see these items here, 100 items. Maybe pop one of these open and we can see the kind of shape here. Am I running out of RAM? Where's my RAM? There we go. Okay, so we can take a look at one of these items. We can see it's got body, ID, title, and user ID, and it's returning a big list. So we are storing that list as state.items here. State.items equals await get items with the search term. In reality, that search term isn't doing anything because we are going to filter using the search term here. So after we've got all of our 100 items, then we're going to narrow it down by filtering and looking at the title and seeing if the title includes the search term. There is a lot of improvement that could be done here. So for example, we might want in title, and we might also want in description. Or body. Well, we'll leave it like that for now. And then you can return is title or is in description. And that will broaden the search behavior out. We might also want to do something like this with the search term, where we say search term equals search term to lowercase dot trim, just to avoid any potential issues that might affect a search operation or a matching operation. But this filter here is just to reduce the 100 items down to a fixed number of results. And so now we clear this and we refresh. There's an error because I did something wrong. I assigned a constant. Okay. So now we can see we've gone from, so we had 10 matches before. Now we have 33 matches because we're looking at more data to match against. But that's how we're filtering and narrowing down our list of items there. And we're storing those as state.results. And finally, rendering the results, and with the list to render into that function. So this is where all of our HTML stuff happens. I'm using document create elements. So I'm creating a list element, a div and an image. And I am setting the ID of the list element to the result, to the result ID of the object I'm dealing with. Setting a class for styling. And I'm setting a random placeholder image using Lorem Pixum, which is a fantastic service, by the way. Bit more, another class for styling purposes, and then adding the text content from the title. And then appending both the image and the div tag inside the list element and returning the list element. So this function doesn't actually show anything on the page. It is responsible for creating one HTML element. It's a list, it'll have an ID, it'll have a class of result, it'll contain an image with a random stock photo, and it will contain the name of the result. That's it. Below, we have render results, which will use the data list, the results that we provided, which was state.results, and it will map this array, i.e. run through the array one by one and apply this behavior. You can see how render result and render results are different functions that do different things. So once we have run through this list, we've now got an array of list elements. They're not yet in the document, but they are ready to go into the document. And here we just have a special case, just in case there was nothing found. So if I search for something weird here, you see there are no results found. That is coming from this render error function, which just creates a list and gives it an error class. So it's not very complicated. It's just saying create list, add an error class, and put the message contents into the text. This last selecting the results element in the document, and it is going to loop through each element and append the list we created here. So this is how you actually insert the HTML you've created into the document. And every time this runs, it will clear the previous results and make it happen all over again. So when I click search again, it will clear the list and allow me to do this all over again. So this is a pretty simple example. This is not really, this is more of a React style hydration strategy than a server-based system where you'd sort of receive this, you'd receive your form response from the server. It wouldn't be happening on the client. But since we're limited in terms of not running a server, that's a sort of nice demo that gives you a feel for how to work with form results. What's the time? Okay. I am going to open to questions now because I think the next session on the subject will be the other side of the equation. So sort of working with a simple Express server just to show you what the actual form response looks like and how you can use that, and how you can also interpret server-side validation messages in a way that's helpful to the user. So if anyone has any questions, go ahead and post them in the chat. Otherwise, I will sit here awkwardly. Thanks. I appreciate that. Okay. All right. If we have no questions, we're all happy with what we've seen, then I will wrap up the session. For those who are feeling lost with the JavaScript side of things, part of the purpose of this session was to show you that you actually don't need JavaScript to do any of this stuff. The JavaScript makes things more fancy and it makes it, it gives you more control. But the fundamentals here is HTML, not JavaScript. The important thing to know is what required does, not what an event listener is. Okay, Christopher, what's your question?
Do you hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Good. What I meant is that can I use this one to just test if my contact form is working by its posting to a different page, like a text file, like that I'm sending the posts and it posting the inputs on a text file without going through servers or anything like that, just checking that everything works and is ready for a server.
Yeah, exactly, and that's sort of what we're doing when we're doing these these local posts. So for this contact form, it's set to post instead of get, and when we send the message, you can see how this looks here. And this is the network tab of DevTools. So this is really useful for testing to see how your form is going to be understood by the server, because this is how the server is going to interpret it. And yeah, it's very, very useful for prototyping and for testing. And you can also sort of do it the other way. So you can check to see what the server is expecting. So look at the object notation for what the server is expecting to have as an input, and you can use those names and values to translate sort of in reverse into HTML, if that makes sense. So you can use a server response to make an HTML form, and you can use an HTML form to make a server response. Okay. All right, no more questions. Well, thank you everyone for joining, and remember, forms are important, use them properly.